Hello everybody, and I haven't done a chess video for quite a while, but thought I would start putting out videos again. I've just played in the 4NCL, Four Nations Chess League, in Reading, England, and I had a very interesting game on Sunday, just gone, against Mike Healey, who is a 2140-ish opponent, FIDE rating. Time control is 100 minutes for the first 40 goes, and then you get 50 minutes added on, and the entire game also has a 30-second increment. So, in addition to having a huge amount of time, you also have to keep recording your game, writing down the moves, even if you only have 30 seconds or so left on your timer. And also, there was a bit of pressure that came with this game because my team kind of had to win to be comfortable in the league tables. So the pressure was on me a bit to not lose. And also, if I won this game, I would go above 2200 FIDE and could claim the Candidate Master title. So I was very eager to win. And I know that Mike Healey is a very strong player and is possibly even international master strength in bizarre openings. So I was thinking that as I was black, I could try and keep the game very solid. And as white, he played b4. So I've done a video on this, the Polish opening, or I think some people call it the orangutan opening. The idea mostly is for white to fianchetto one or both of his bishops or her bishops, and the b4 move is a lot more aggressive than b3. It gains some space on the queen side, so white could even try going into a c4 English opening setup if I allow it. So I decide I'm going to play fairly principled and attack the b4 pawn with my f8 bishop, as well as get a pawn into the center. Bishop b2 was his response, so fairly natural move, just developing the bishop and also going after my pawn. And we've already reached a major crossroads in this opening. I can play more sort of solid and passive and very very principled, where I can defend my key central pawn with maybe pawn d6. And then the idea is that because I've moved both my pawns in the center, I can therefore move both my bishops out quickly. And white's just been doing stuff on the edge of the board, on the wing, so black should get more central control and therefore be maybe a tiny bit better, or at least equalize. However, I chose bishop takes b4, and he captured straight back. So this is the second of the two options. I chose to play a little bit more fluidly. I thought that if I did the first option of playing d6, it would let him dictate what happened in the game. At least now he's having to respond to my moves. And at this point, he's moved his bishop twice. I've only moved mine once, so I've got a kind of development tempo. I can bring out one of my knights, and I could go horribly wrong if I play knight c6, because white has bishop takes g7, winning my pawn and the rook as well, and more or less forcing me to resign or be in a terrible position for the rest of the game. So I can't do d6 for the same reason. And I think f6 is a move, but I never liked it. To steal from one other chess sort of personality, never play f6. So the part of the reason is that even though it attacks the bishop and makes it move again, after bishop b2, my knight on g8's very unhappy. It doesn't really want to go to h6 because knights on the edge of the board are very sort of cramped, and they're a bit useless really, unless unless they can quickly come back into the centre of the board. And knight e7 would be the only other square the knight could go to, and it just cramps the rest of my pieces. I can't really use the open e-file for my rook until I move the knight. True, it allows me to castle, but white can simply develop pieces, and I just feel like I've weakened my light squares as well. So, for example, white could play c4, force me to trade off both my central pawns, while white keeps both of theirs, and develops a bishop with tempo. Maybe white would castle, and even though I would have some small chance of initiative due to my bishops both having a lot more sort of space to move around, I still feel after white consolidates in the centre with their pawns, for example, this pawn chain, f2, e3, d4, is very hard to break down, very hard to challenge it. And I just don't really like black's position. I feel like black's going to really struggle to make use of their pieces, especially the knights. So I didn't play pawn f6. Going back to the previous position, I play knight f6, preventing bishop takes g7. And I'm happy if white takes the knight. If I take back with the queen, I don't ruin my pawn integrity. My pawns are all still side by side. I bring the queen out with tempo, with allowing me to develop another piece. And also I'm attacking the rook on a1 at the same time. So the usual move here is knight f3, knight c6. d6 also possible, but I prefer playing d5 in one go. And white usually wants to keep the bishop pair. They want to have both their bishops on the board for most of the game, really, because especially at very high level chess, the sort of established wisdom is that bishops are better than knights the longer the game goes on. So in the end games, bishops often can overpower the knights. So he'd probably go back to b2, pawn d5. White would have to be a little bit reserved and play e3, castles, and white may just want to complete development with bishop e2. I would get my rook on the open line, open file, castles, and maybe bishop f5. So I've already got all my minor pieces out. I've castled and I've got my e8 rook on pretty much the perfect square. I'm ready to connect rooks, possibly with queen e7, maybe with queen to the d file somewhere. Either play rook a d8 or play rook e7, then rook a e8 to double on the e file. And even though white has the two central pawns and I only have one of the central pawns left, I can't help feeling like black has pretty much equalized. So that didn't happen, though. He played an unusual move, knight c3. So knight c3 looks like a fine move. It develops a minor piece, and if I take it, he can recapture with the bishop and not ruin the pawn structure. However, after knight c6, the bishop on e5 is now a bit stuck. If it stays where it is, I'll take it. And if it moves back to f4 or to g3, it's gone off of the long diagonal. It's no longer on the h8 to a1 diagonal, going corner to corner, which is arguably the best place for the bishop. So here he actually chose to give me the bishop pair. I took with the queen, and I thought for a second that he was being very generous with this. I have the bishop pair, he doesn't. And I've got more pieces developed than he does. But his next move showed that I can't keep the bishops for very long. He played knight d5. So this is kind of a triple fork. It's attacking the queen. Also, it's planning on getting the bishop on b4 next turn. And also, if I'm not careful, he can take on c7 with check, and then do an additional fork and be attacking my rook on a8, which I won't be able to save. So just before I move the queen, I looked briefly at bishop takes pawn check on d2. The idea is if the white queen recaptures, then my queen can take on a1, can take the rook, because the white queen will have been deflected away. However, the king can actually take it, and even though his king's a little in the open, I don't really have enough for the sacrificed piece. And the king can always just run back to where it started, and I don't really feel like it's enough. So I play queen e5, which is not the normal move. Most players do queen d6 in the games that have reached this position previously. However, I think my move's better, actually. Not just because I think I'm better than all those players, I don't. But after knight takes bishop, knight takes back on b4, I've set quite a lot of traps. My queen on e5 is more or less perfect in order to set all these traps for white. So, for example, if white does knight f3, can you see the winning move for black? If you like, you can pause the video for a little while to try and find the move. Okay, so there are actually two moves, but I definitely prefer one to the other. Queen takes a1. You could have done knight takes c2 check as well, but with queen takes rook, the white queen more or less has to take it, otherwise black's won a rook for nothing. And now knight takes c2 check, for king, queen, and king. After I take the queen, white can win my knight back. I can't escape with it. But the reason I prefer this continuation over the knight takes pawn before I took the rook is that, number one, the queens have come off, so that completely eliminates pretty much all white's chances of counter-attacking and getting a good position. And secondly, it's taking white an extra few moves to recapture my knight. And whilst that's going on, I can just quickly play a simple set of moves: d6, bishop f5 with check and developing. And even though I don't need to at this point, I think castling is very safe. So there's absolutely no possibility of me blundering horribly. Well, nearly no possibility. I do still sometimes blunder. But at least now my king is extra safe and the rooks are connected, so I'm very confident I could win here. So that didn't happen. He didn't play knight f3, but I was hoping he would play pawn c3. The idea being that my knight would have to move, and also I can't play queen takes rook anymore, and also knight c2 check. He'll take back with the queen, and I still can't take the rook, so there's no tactic around the rook. However, there is one very big problem with this. Can you see black's winning move? Well, if you've seen some positions in the Budapest or the Caracan, you'll probably have spotted it straight away. Knight d3, checkmate. The pawn on e2 is pinned, because if it took the knight, my queen on e5 could have taken the king. So that's why queen e5, in my opinion, is better than queen d6. Because in this position, I wouldn't have been able to play knight d3 mate, and there wouldn't have been any tactics with queen takes rook either, because if the queen was on d6, it can't take the rook from that square. So he didn't fall for it, though. He isn't rated over 2100 for nothing. He played rook b1, which I think is the best move on the board. So cutting out any chance of queen takes rook and not falling into checkmate. So here I've got the choice. Do I take the pawn on a2 or do I do something else? What would you play in this position? Alright, so the best move is actually defending the knight with pawn a5. And the reason for that is that you're still potentially able to take the pawn very soon. So white's best move is apparently pawn a3, and then you can move the knight back. But if white does something else, like knight f3, which looks very tempting, attacking the queen with a developing move. There's queen e4 going after the c2 pawn. d3, again, looks very interesting and good because it's attacking the queen whilst defending and also moving out the central pawn. But then queen c6 makes life very difficult. If white tries defending the pawn in the wrong way, I could win a lot of material. For example, if rook b2, queen c3 check, forking the undefended rook and the king. So white will lose a rook for nothing. And if, for example, c4, which may be best, now I can take on a2. And I have the escape square b4, as well as also having knight c3, which would fork queen and rook if white isn't very careful. So that's the best move. Knight c6 and knight d5 are okay as well, but I played the wrong move. I took. What I missed was, after knight f3, I thought that I could just put my queen anywhere, really, queen c5, and then c3. And I didn't realize that c3 was such a strong move. It stops my knight escaping via b4, and it also is creating a plan of the white queen moving to either c2, b3 or a4, and going after my knight, which is undefended. So I thought for a while I could play pawn d6, queen moves somewhere, and then bishop e6, defending the knight. Not only is this insufficient in several ways, one way in particular is if I play d6, white has queen a4 check, and I'd have to get out of check and lose the knight. So I had also planned on sacrificing my knight, but I can't play it here. If white plays d takes c3, I'll take with the queen, and I think I'll be okay. I'll have 3 pawns for the knight. But can you see white's move, which pretty much wins on the spot? Yeah, there is queen c2 as a move. And I will lose the knight for nothing. If I move the knight anywhere, either my queen will be undefended, so I'll lose the whole queen, or if I play knight e4 or knight a4, the white queen can just take the knight. And if I leave my knight where it is, either the queen or pawn will take me. So I couldn't play that, I had to play queen a5. So I've now moved the queen quite a lot of times already. And white actually now was a bit complacent. He didn't play very accurately. I think that he was under the impression he could take time to win the knight and just get his pieces out. So the best move is actually queen c2, going straight for the black knight. And if I try the whole d6 idea, there's rook a1, bishop e6 to defend, but then there's knight d4. And if I move my bishop to d5, white can play e4, and the bishop can't really go anywhere without being taken by something. And if I play something else like castles, I still just go into a terrible position after knight takes bishop. I recapture, and white has succeeded in removing the defender of the knight on a2, so they can simply take it. And I've lost a knight for a pawn. So it's more or less game over at this level. I wouldn't expect to even get a draw. So that was the best line, but he chose instead the idea of pawn e3. And I think the plan here was to play bishop c4, and then to play, say, rook a1 and take. So that way he'd have brought out an extra piece before capturing the knight. The problem here, though, is that I will lose the knight. I've pretty much given it up. But I can do a desperado. I can get the knight for 2 pawns. With knight takes, capture's more or less forced, and then queen takes, c3 check. So in this position, it's hard to evaluate because it's a very very sort of imbalanced position. So I've got 7 pawns, white has 4, and I've got 3 connected passed pawns. C7, B7, A7 are all able to get to the end of the board without being blocked off or taken by a white pawn. However, white has an extra knight. So the question really is, who's going to be better? Is it going to be the person with the knight or the person with the pawns? After knight d2, white's chosen not to trade pieces with the other alternative queen d2. So I think white thinks the more pieces are on the board, the easier it'll be to coordinate them all and gang up on my weak pawns. And the more pieces you have to attack, the more likely it is that one of the pawns will fall. If we just cleared the board of all the pieces, barring all the pawns, kings, and white's knight, it may be harder for the knight to gang up on my pawns that are all passed. So I think that was his thinking, and my thinking was roughly similar. I thought I don't really need to exchange unless it's very beneficial to me. So I castle, and white isn't going for sort of very, very dynamic tactics. All they're doing is just simply completing development with castling, and then choosing the line of attack to sort of create the plan. And my plan's very, very straightforward. All I'm thinking is that if my pawns stay roughly where they are, then I'm not really going to be able to prove their worth and prove that they're a match for the knight. However, if I can push at least 3 of them into white's half of the board, so onto the 4th rank or further up, I think they'll be able to overpower the knight. So my first move is d5, which may look a bit strange because it's the only one of the 4 pawns on the queen side which can't get to the end due to the e3 white pawn. But there is a reason to play it, and the main reason is it takes away both e4 and c4 for white's minor pieces. So it makes them a bit more cramped, and it also lets my bishop have some scope. I next play b6 after white has castled. The reason for that is that I'm thinking if my bishop on c8 moved, the b7 pawn would be taken by white's rook. I can't give up any of the pawns, because if I do, I think then it's just easily winning for white. I think a knight versus 2 pawns is not even close. So rook c1, attacking the queen, skewering it to c7. Can you see how I defend the pawn? Okay, yeah, I think you probably found it. Queen e5, only move to save the queen and the pawn. White then played knight f3, so trying to move forwards and get the queen with tempo, make it move again. And my queen is already tied down to c7, but it also is now tied down to the d5 pawn, because if I say move to e7, the white queen could take on d5. So I have to go queen d6, queen b3, and part of the idea of queen b3 is to have his pieces on the queen side, so eyeing the pawns, and also moving forwards will be beneficial because that way he's less cramped, and also it's connecting rooks and allowing his f1 rook to join the battle with rook f d1. So at this point I'm a little bit concerned that I can't push the pawns far enough up the board in time. So I quickly try throwing them up with c5. And again, we've got a strange thing where normally you'd want to start pushing the pawns on the edge of the board very, very quickly up because they're further away from white's pieces. But I think if I do that, this is still close enough to a middle game. Well, it's still a middle game, really. So I would neglect control of the center. So my c5 and d5 pawns are actually very good in controlling the key central squares. Rook f d1 going for the pawn, and I thought here bishop e6 looks okay, but I then don't really want my bishop to be completely hemmed in by my own pawns. So bishop b7 was my move. And also I may have some sort of dream where I can try and attack the king, the poor white king. My bishop's pointing at that general area. So here he played a very sneaky move, because can you see why white playing bishop c4 is terrible? Yeah, so if white plays bishop c4, I can actually take it. Even though my queen is now in the firing line of the white rook, I will be able to capture white's queen back, and I've won the piece straight back. Now I'm 3 pawns up for pretty much nothing, so I should win. The move white chose then was queen a2, so the idea is to play bishop c4 next turn, and the white queen won't be able to be captured. I do rook fd8, so again I'm thinking that the battle is on the queen side, so if I moved the rook on a8 to d8, my 2 rooks would be both in the centre and on the king's side, so they'd be in the wrong place. Also, queen takes a7 would be something I'd have to worry about as well. So rook fd8 makes a lot of sense. And white does a very unusual move, but here it's quite strong actually. Knight e1. So the idea is that the knight was on the king's side and not really doing a lot. It looked good, but it wasn't attacking anything, and it wasn't really able to move forwards anywhere of consequence. So the plan is to move the knight over to the queen's side, maybe target a few of my pawns, or just restrain them in some way. And also it clears the f3 square for the white bishop. It can't go to, well, it very soon won't be able to go to c4 when I move my queen out of the d file. So f3 is the only other square where it can attack my d5 pawn. And I go queen e7 and bishop f3. So he's attacking d5 3 times, I'm only defending it twice. And I play a move which normally wouldn't be very good. If I defend the pawn again with the queen, I've moved that queen so many times that I feel like I will have not made the most of the fact I could push the pawns. So I play pawn c4. Again, now having the first pawn in white's half of the board, and it's taking away d3 for the white knight, so it can't go as far forwards as it wants to. The reason this will be bad normally is that because I've got my pawns on d5 and c4, as they're on light squares, they're not controlling or influencing any of the dark squares. So white has the d4 square under complete control. So knight c2 to d4 is something I have to watch out for. A knight on that blockading square where no pawn can chase it away is very, very strong. So even though c4 is not that good in a normal middle game, here I think it's more important that I push the pawns. And if knight c2, I was probably just going to keep pushing with b5. So he does rook b1 first, preventing b5. And here, if I play pawn a6, trying to play b5 next turn, the white rook could take on b6, because if I play pawn a6, there's nothing defending my b6 pawn anymore. So queen c5, defending the pawn and preparing to push. Queen b2. So again, this is a game of very heavy in strategy. If white can successfully prevent me pushing my pawns and keep improving pieces as well, they should win. And if I can just keep pushing pawns, eventually they should be able to overpower the knight. So all my energy is going into pushing b5. I'll give you a few seconds. How can I try to push b5 in the next couple of moves without losing it or losing any other pawns? Yeah, I play bishop c6. Bishop a6 also does try to play b5, but then it will be blocking my a7 pawn. And also it may be vulnerable as it's not defended on a6. At least here it's defended, and also it's keeping an eye on the d5 pawn. Rook bc1. So white now realizes they can't play they can't prevent me playing b5, so they go for another trick. If I played b5, can you see white's move, which will improve one of the worst pieces on the board? Yeah, because the rook went to c1, it pinned my my c4 pawn. So knight d3 is now on the cards. It attacks the queen and it centralizes the knight. So when I move backwards, knight f4, knight e5 are both moves, but to me, knight b4 would be very deadly. It's threatening the bishop on c6 as well as the pawn on d5. And if I go over to defend the bishop and move my queen for the umpteenth time, white could simply take off my bishop, which, even though it was a technically bad bishop, called this because its own pawns were blocking its path, it was very good as a defender. And now I've lost the key defender of d5, and white can simply come over with the rooks and queen and eventually take it. And the position is so bad that this is one of the top computer moves, at least my computer. So this is pretty much lost, even though I have 3 passed pawns. The fact that they're doubled and that the white rooks are very active means that I won't be able to keep them very long. The extra bishop that white has should be able to clean up the pawns, and also white will then be a pawn up as well if they manage to capture all 3 of my queenside pawns. So I can't really allow knight d3 to be played. So I played a move which prevents knight d3. Can you guess what I played? Again, I'll give you about 10 seconds to pause the video. Yeah, I play my queen again to e7. If I do queen d6, which also looks interesting, there's rook takes c4, and even though it's actually not that bad because I would get 2 rooks for a queen, I can't help feeling like white's queen will be able to overpower the rooks. Queen b4 is one move which the computer gives, and rook a d8 is good. Bishop takes f3 is also a move, and then white can actually play g takes f3. So here I would manage to keep a couple of pawns on the board, and white's in no rush. So the reason they played h4 was just to prevent any possible back rank checkmates in this variation. And again, I do have 2 pawns and I have 2 rooks, which could be useful, but I think that white's knight can make itself better by blockading on c2, so I can't push the pawn anymore. And I think white's majority on the king side means that they're perhaps a little better. But one thing's for certain, I don't think I can win this game. I think I could maybe draw it with very accurate play, but I think that white does have all the chances to win. So I'm playing for 2 results. I'm playing for a draw or a loss. So I didn't really want to play queen d6 and go into a possibly theoretical drawn position, but in practice a very hard game to hold. So instead I went queen e7, and what's quite nice is that if white tries knight d3 again, if I take the knight, it's really bad because rook takes c6. But I have a move, bishop a4, I guess a double attack or a fork on white's rook and knight. If white saves the rook on d1, then I can take the knight. And if white saves the knight or attacks my bishop, I will capture the rook and win the exchange. So that will even it out and make my pawns even stronger. So white can't do that. They instead played rook d4. So one possible idea is to play knight d3 next turn, and then bishop a4 won't attack. It won't attack a rook anymore because of white moving it to d4. Also, it blockades as well, and possibly rook c d1 is coming to gang up on d5. And finally, I play b5, so making my bishop even worse. But again, it's a good defensive piece. And I think it's actually better than white's bishop. I think this is a case of white having a bad, good bishop and black having a good, bad bishop, if that makes any sense. Knight c2. So again, white can't really go to d3, I don't think. Just because I think if white does play knight d3, I could still just keep playing pawn a5. So instead, knight c2 may plan on playing knight d4 in a moment after the rook moves somewhere. But I push. I can't afford to do anything else. My pieces are actually about as good as they can get. My rook on a8 possibly has a better square on either b8 or c8. But I can't really see a better square for my queen. With maybe c5 is good, but I'd waste a lot of time playing queen back to c5. Bishop's as good as it can be, and the rook on d8 is doing its job. Whereas white is also in a bit of a quandary as to what to do with some of their pieces. But I think it's obvious that white can improve in some way, maybe with rook b1 or rook a1, or rook on d4 moving and then knight d4. But he went rook cd1, so ganging up on d5. And at the time, I thought I found a brilliant move, which, in the cold hard light of the computer evaluation, I have to admit I misevaluated. I had thought I can't save the pawn, and it's not really worth it trying to. I was going to give up the pawn and push the rest of the queenside pawns into white's half. My two choices really then are b4 or defending the pawn maybe for one more move and then playing b4. Just a note, if I play a4, I really don't like it because all my pawns are on light squares and white can now easily blockade with either knight b4 or say queen c3 first and then knight b4. And a knight on a dark square will block my pawns, and because of the way a knight moves, a knight always attacks the opposite colour to the square it's standing on. So a knight on a dark square will attack light squares, and on b4 it will attack my bishop and my pawn on d5. So the best move is actually the one I did not play, b4. Rook g4, so a bit aggressive, trying to go for checkmate on g7. But I have to move pawn c3. And that's what I missed in the game. I thought I had to play f6, which wouldn't have been nearly as good. So the queen moves back, and now, again, I don't need to worry too much about d5. It's a lost cause. I could do bishop a4 to pin the knight and try and extract some advantage from the position. But I thought maybe rook a b8 was better, getting out of the crosshairs of the white bishop, and also planning on pushing the pawn on b4 even further. So if knight d4, I could save the bishop and also gain tempo with bishop d7, rook g3, and then maybe just something like queen e5, centralizing the queen. White may have to play pawn h4 to avoid any potential back rank mates, and maybe threaten rook g5, going for a sort of skewer on the d5 pawn. But I didn't quite see this far in my head, because if I had been able to see this, I think I may have noticed that there's a potential win for black here. Not with any one-hit wonder, just sort of one-move winning, but in the way the pieces are positioned. There's a thing called trending, which is where you look at the position and you see which side can improve the most from here. So even if one side has all their pieces on good squares, if they can't really make their position better and the other side can, then often their advantage is sort of illusory. The other side can catch up and get all their pieces to good squares and keep on improving. And here, I can't really see a way for white to improve the position. The rook on g3, maybe you can go to g5, but I can always cut that out with pawn h6. And apart from that, the knight's perfect, the bishop on f3 is doing what it can. Rook on d1 is pretty much in the best square I can be, and the queen on b1 is, again, fairly good. My pieces aren't great, but I've got the queenside pawns, which I can keep on improving by pushing them. So I could go h6, like white as a passing move, like rook c1, and then I just keep pushing. And at first, when I left the computer on, it said that it was roughly even, but after I've made a few moves here, and all computer moves, so I'm not making just random moves for white, at around this point, after rook dc8, it gives black a massive advantage because it now realizes that white doesn't really have any plan. There's no sort of coherent strategy here, whereas black has a very, very simple sort of theme of pushing the queenside pawns. And at this point, I think it gives black as about being about sort of -3, roughly. So you can check if you want on your computers, but it should give black as having a big advantage. So I didn't do that, and possibly missed a simple win if I'd have played the right move. I actually played queen f6 first, with the idea that I'm pinning the rook on d4, so I'm improving my queen and making white untangle themselves. So white played queen c1, and what this does is it now allows me to play b4, and the white queen is in a less active position. However, it's not quite as good because, weirdly enough, in the previous position, black played pawn c3 with tempo on the queen. When the queen was on b2, it had to move again, and that was the key feature. Whereas here, because I've made a more or less pointless queen move, white's actually gained a tempo on the previous position, because when I play c3, white will have a free move. They won't have to react to their queen on b2 being attacked, if any of that makes sense. So white does win the pawn, and I take off bishops, because white does have a good bishop after all, and I don't think it's tenable if I don't swap off bishops. So now we're now, I think, into an ending, I can safely say. There's only heavy pieces on the board, barring the imbalanced knight versus 3 pawns. And even though I am only 2 pawns up, if you don't count the knight, I think that the extra white pawn on the king's side is more or less meaningless. These pawns are never really going to play. All they're being used for is defending the king. So I don't really count them as being sort of tangibly worth a pawn. All I'm counting is the 3 pawns on the queen's side, because they're the ones that can actually attack and influence the game. So I don't want to trade rooks yet, because my rook on d8 is much more active than the white rook on d1, because it's blocked in by its own rook. So if I take, all I'm doing is basically removing the rooks on the back rank from the game. So I play c3, and at this point I'm fairly happy if white trades everything. If white takes off all the rooks with rook takes d8, rook takes, queen takes, I would then have lots and lots of plans, like queen d2 might be a move I could do later, or I could push b3. And at this point, the fewer pieces are on the board, the fewer white has to both attack and defend my pawns. So at this point, my pawns are far enough advanced that I would be happy with all the rooks and the queens coming off the board. Then I don't think the knight can possibly hold all 3 pawns back, especially as the white king is nowhere near the action on the queen side. So we played rook b5, targeting my pawns, and in rook and pawn endings, you often do want to attack enemy pawns from behind, especially if they're passed pawns. And here I could take the rook, queen takes, but again I feel like I'm activating white's pieces. The white queen would then have the d-file, and I don't really think I can cope with that rook on b5. So I play rook b8, rook a b8, and I had thoughts about rook d b8, but then I felt like white could simply play rook d1 to d5. And again, my rook on a8 does look good because it's behind the a5 pawn, so I can push that. But again, I don't think it's sufficient. And here white has an interesting choice. They could do rook takes d8, check, but then I could take it with my queen, and I'd be defending a5, and my queen would have the d file. And his rook would be attacked on b5, so he may have to swap off the second pair of rooks. And again, I think I'm very happy if it's just queens and knight on the board. So I was hoping he would do rook takes a5, winning a pawn, but I think 2 pawns on the third rank for black is actually stronger than even a rook. Because if you cleared off all the pieces except for the rook on d1 and the pawns, and let's just assume there's no back rank checkmate. Let's assume I played pawn h6 and white's played pawn h3. If I played pawn b3, so all there was left was my 2 pawns on c3 and b3, white had a rook on d1, my 2 pawns can overpower the rook. The rook cannot catch both pawns before I queen one of them. So I'm happy to trade off rook takes, queen takes, and now I have b3. So at this point, white's in real trouble. Knight d4, c2. So again, white has an interesting choice of moves, and they all lose. We'll take the sort of more passive one, queen c1. And if I play b2, it's not very good because white can actually take on b2. And if I retook, if I took the queen with my rook, white has rook a8 checkmate. Again, there's back rank problems. So I have to first go queen d8 to guard my rook and defend the back row, attack the rook on a5, so when white moves it to safety, I can now play b2. And this is completely winning. The best line is rook takes pawn. I take the queen and make it either a queen or rook. White takes back. And now my queen should easily be able to beat a knight and a pawn. He may make it difficult for me, but I think I can be fairly confident in my abilities and just grind out a win here. So that was not played, and actually this whole line wasn't played, but I thought this was quite an interesting position. If white takes on c2 with the knight, giving up their minor piece for the dangerous pawns, it appears that white is now actually better because they've got an extra pawn on the queen side. There's no, back rank mate. For black, white's guarding all the back row squares at the moment. And, give whites and black a few moves for just shuffling around a bit and consolidating. And it may be a draw with very accurate play from black. However, it's black's move, and there is a winning move. Again, I'll give you 10 seconds or so. Try and find the winning move for black. Well, if you found it, you're very, very good at tactics. Queen c3. It's a startlingly good move, and not one that is easy to see, especially if you're the defending side. What's amazing is it's a kind of triple attack. I'm threatening queen on c2, rook on a5, and I'm also threatening back rank mates with queen e1 checkmate. So if, for example, rook a8, with the idea that if I take the queen, they take my rook and they mate me, and if I take the rook, they actually take my queen, and I can't play rook a1 checkmate because white's queen will then be on c3, and they could take my rook on a1. But I do have queen e1 checkmate. So it's quite funny, both rooks and queens, they're all on prees at once, and I can't take any of them, and they can't take me. So rook a8 doesn't work. If queen d1 to guard against mate and save the queen, I would take the rook. And if there was some sort of move like, a queen to d3, rook b1 checkmate, as mentioned. And if white does any move to guard both pieces, so queen a2, queen f5, queen a4, rook c5, rook a2, I will always have queen e1 mate. So white will lose either a queen, a rook, or get mated. So he spent about 20 minutes on this line, which stems from this position on the board now, after I've just played rook a b8. And basically all that's forced if he takes the pawn on a5. So he spent 20 minutes, and I think he worked it all out, or at least he didn't like it enough to not to go into it. So he instead took my rook, and I took back. And now, even though my rook has ceded the d-file to him, he hasn't infiltrated. He hasn't got his rook up the board and into my half. So I'm fairly happy there. Knight d4. So again, very strong move from white. It's probably the best chance with knight d4. So it blockades. Well, not blockades. Sorry, it interferes with my queen's guard of c3. That means if I play pawn b3, the white queen can simply take on c3. The knight's also controlling squares in front of my pawns, so I can't play b3 or c2. Even if the white queen didn't have c3 to take, it would still be a bad idea to play c2 or b3 as well. So I could play a4 here, but instead I thought that if I play a4, then white may have time to consolidate with possibly queen c2. And then if I play b3, again, c3 is taken. So I played queen a6. And the idea of this move is I want to play queen c4, and then I can play pawn b3 because my queen will be guarding the c3 pawn. And the only way of playing queen c4 is to go a6 first. So white then plays e4, so they're trying to use the knight to attack. Queen c4. And here I did see that the white queen can now move out onto the f4 or g5 squares. That was the reason the e4 was played, to get out the way of the white queen. And in my analysis, I thought that queen f4 threatened rook b8, so it was the best move. But computer analysis shows that after rook d8, queen g5, this was the line I was really, really worried about, because can you see why rook takes d4 is a terrible move from black? Again, back rank problems. There is a lovely checkmate with queen d8. So this is called the X-ray attack, or in this case, I guess, the X-ray defense. My rook can take the queen, but the white rook on d1 was sort of guarding the white queen, X-raying my rook. Sort of, it's as though my rook on when my rook was on d4, it was almost transparent. So white can then take the rook and checkmate. So I can't play rook takes d4. And because my rook's attacked, if I move the rook anywhere else, like a8, then white has knight f5, threatening both rook d8, leading to mate, and also queen takes g7. And what's very nice is if I play pawn g6, or if I play king f8, white can actually give up their queen with queen d8. And after the rook captures my rook, it will be checkmate due to the knight on f5 guarding the e7 square. And if I'd done g6, it would still be mate because the knight's guarding g7 as well. So after knight f5, there isn't actually any way of stopping mate. It's mate in about 3 or 4 moves. So I thought I would be losing, but I eventually saw I could play queen c7. But I was feeling like white must have some sort of win here. However, the computer is just very calm about it and says black is about -2. So it's actually a much, much better position for black. But I was very scared and was sort of thinking there must be some tactic I hadn't seen. So I probably would have played it and then been very surprised to realise I wasn't completely losing. But white didn't play queen f4. They instead did queen g5, possibly having seen that I was actually not really in any danger. So the idea here is that it hasn't provoked my rook to d8, but they're still threatening knight f5 next turn. And also the a5 pawn is under attack. So if I go about playing pawn a4 to save it and push on, again, knight f5 wins on the spot. Again, nothing I can do. So I gave up the a5 pawn and realised that I shouldn't play f6 because never play f6. I didn't like the idea of opening up the diagonal to my king, so I played pawn h6, making the queen move so it won't be on such a good square to control both d8 and g7 with all these mate threats. Also, it gives luft, it gives air for my king, so there's no back rank mates anymore, as I always have h7 to move to. And after the queen takes the pawn, I can now play pawn c2. b3 is not nearly as good, because c2 is much more forcing. If the white rook moves, I can either make a queen on c1, or I can just take the knight on d4. So the only move for white is knight takes c2, queen takes, and we're now in a very simple ending with just 4 pawns each, queen and rook. But the one key point is that my pawn on b4 is a passed pawn, and also it's known as the outside passed pawn. It's furthest away from the rest of the armada of pawns. So if white played rook d8, rook takes, queen takes, king h7, and what's remarkable is my queen is on the perfect square, because all I plan to do now is just play pawn b3, pawn b2, pawn b1, queen. And with rook and pawn endings, it's very hard to promote passed pawns as long as the other person's rook is somewhat active. So if you waved a wand and both the queens turned into rooks, this would probably be a drawn ending, albeit quite a difficult one for white to draw. But with queens, the queen doesn't have to defend the pawn by standing in front of it or directly going behind it. It can be off to the side, and it can just help the pawn go forwards, because it's defending every square in front of the black pawn. And what's really nice is that if white first escapes checkmate with pawn h4, so no back rank mates, I push, and queen d7. I push anyway, don't care about white's queen. So if they take on f7, I'll just make a queen. And f5 check. If I go g6, then white can take on f7 and just keep going queen f8, queen f7, queen f8, queen f7, draw by perpetual. But after king d8, it would be a draw if white could play queen c8 check, I move back, and then queen f5 again, repeating. But my queen on c2 is perfect. It prevents queen c8. So white does a move and I can just queen. And now it's a very simple win. So white can't afford to play that line. Instead, we were almost at time control here. We're at move 39, where white played queen a1. And again, if you have a passed pawn, just push it. So b3. I think my best chance of winning is to push the pawn further up the board. Queen b1. Preventing pawn b2, because then my queen will be undefended. So at this point, we're basically at time control, and I've got maybe 5 minutes on my clock to make the last move. And so I thought for a couple of minutes, I don't need to rush too much, because I gain 50 minutes after this. So as long as I can make the move in 5 minutes or so, I'm fine. And I realised that if I take either the rook or queen, I don't quite have enough time to win. So, for example, if queen takes queen, rook takes, push. If it was my move again, I could play rook c8, and then rook c1 checkmate, or check, and then white's rook takes me, then I take back with the pawn. But after king f1, rook c8, rook takes b2, and I can't, if I play rook c1, then there's king e2, and I've lost my passed pawn. So now this would be a very hard position to hold. Again, it's probably drawn with best play, but I don't want to have to play this line at all, especially when I'm completely winning. So I can't do that. And the more fancy-looking queen takes rook check, queen takes b2, white has queen b1, and white actually can win this fairly easily. Even though the white queen can't move because I push the pawn up. what they can do is they can just bring their king all the way over to c2 and take the pawn. I'll take back, and their king will take it. So they'll give up their queen for the rook and pawn. And then the only things left on the board will be white's 4 pawns, black's 3. And in just a pure king and pawn ending, 99% of the time, you can win when you're a pawn up fairly comfortably. So I can't do that. So instead, I just play simple. Rook c8, guard the queen, and then that allows b2 next turn. So we'd reached time control, and he didn't make me wait too long. He quickly played king f1, just to show that basically everything loses. If h4, again to avoid back rank checkmates, I can now play b2, and it doesn't really matter what white plays. The computer's line is rook d8 check, but if queen takes queen, I would just take back and then play rook c1. So king h7. It's important not to take the rook, because if I take on d8, white can then take my queen on c2 without recapture. And then I'd have to play rook b8 and then queen b1, and we'd get the same position as before, where the white king comes over and gives up his queen for the pawn and rook. So king h7, queen takes, rook b8 to attack the pawn from behind. But now my pawn is close enough to promote, and I win by 1 tempo. If it was white's move in this position, can you see how white tries to hold on? Yeah, king h2 would hold it, because I could take on f2, and then maybe I'm winning, but it would be very, very hard to win. But here I can play rook c1 with check, so white cannot take b2. And then I make a queen, and it's game over. So he can't play pawn h4. Wrong position. So if queen takes c2, I could take with the rook and then play b2 and then rook c1. But even quicker is b takes c2. Rook c1 to block, only move. And then I can play rook d1. And again, there's nothing white can do. If they take the pawn on c2, rook d1 mate, and if they don't take it and play king f1, I can then do rook d1 check. If they take the rook, I'll take with the queen, checkmate. I'll take the pawn with the pawn, make it a queen and be checkmate. And if the king moves, I take the rook. And I can't save the pawn, but this is, again, completely winning. I'll easily be able to win this with an extra rook, and also I'm gobbling up all of white's pawns as well. So the last couple of moves of the game were white playing king f1. I played b2. And I think he actually resigned at this point, or possibly even the move before, because now we reach a very similar position to what I just showed. If king e1, I can play rook c1. And even though white's rook is guarded, there's nothing to prevent my pawn becoming a queen next turn. If rook takes rook, pawn takes equals queen, and if not, I can play, for example, if f3, I can play rook takes rook to keep it simple and not give white any chance at all, just take off white's only piece left, and then make a queen, and it's a fairly easy win. So with this game, our team won in the match. We won 4-2, so I guess a draw would have been enough, but if I'd have lost, it would have been a level match at 3-all. My rating went over 2200, or it's going to on the 1st of April, so for April Fools I'll be 2200. And I think I may try claiming the Candidate Master title, because it just sounds quite nice. So, I mean, I don't, I don't think that I was better for quite a lot of that game. I think I was quite a bit worse. But the key point is that when you have imbalanced positions, you have to know how to play them. So I think he didn't maybe activate his pieces in the best way, and he did let me push those pawns up the board maybe a little bit too easily. But it is very difficult to